welcome to the Urea webinar, the State of Play in South Australia. I'm your facilitator today. My name's Brad Perry. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Grain Producers SA. As a way of background, GPSA is the peak body representing about 4,500 grain producers in South Australia. We've been receiving a lot of feedback and questions from grain producers across the state about the situation with urea supply. And we wanted to bring you some of the industry representative and experts on this topic to provide you with factual information as to how urea supply has got to where it has this season. Thank you also to Ag Communicators for helping us to run the webinar today. We've assembled a great lineup of speakers this afternoon who are going to provide some excellent information on urea supply, both nationally and in SA, and how we've reached this point. I'll hand over to GrainGrowers Advocacy and Rural Affairs Manager Sean Cole, who will take us through some background on where urea comes from, why we've hit a perfect storm this year, and what's in store for urea supply in the future. We'll then hear from Australian Ag's favourite Scotsman, Andrew Whitelaw, from episode 3. He'll take us through some of the data on urea imports and pricing challenges before handing over to Fertilizer Australia CEO Stephen Annells. He'll talk about the reasons for the shortfall, land lead times, what the future holds for urea, and an update on the domestic situation with urea supply. To round out today's webinar, we'll also put your questions to our experts. On that note, just on questions, we'll save those until the final session. However, if you do have a question during each presentation, please make sure you pop it in the Q&A box below when you think of it. We'll collate all the questions and we'll put them to the panel later on. You won't have the opportunity to turn your mic on and ask the question live, so please make sure that you use the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Just a reminder too that we're after questions that we can all learn from, so not just statements. We will endeavour to try and get all the questions asked that we can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Sean Cole from GrainGrowers, who's going to explain this year's situation. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Brad. And just a personal thank you, and a thank you from GrainGrowers to involve us in this. So really appreciate that. Already done the intro, so might as well get straight into it. So I guess obviously everyone's acutely aware of the shortages and potential near misses we're having there in South Australia at the moment with urea. Three main topics. Firstly, where do we get it from? Andrew will cover that as well, so I'll just do a very brief overview. Then the second step is to look at how we got here and understanding the supply chain and the dynamics. And then thirdly, we'll just go into a bit of work that GrainGrowers is actually doing as well to try and help things along in the future, to try and make things a little less painful. So without further ado, just getting into where we get it from. Like most growers will be aware that since late 2022, we've become exclusively an importer of urea. We had a plant in Gibson Island, which was shut down. They used to make about 250,000 to 300,000 tonnes per year of urea, depending on the season. So that's only about 15% of Australia's total demand. So growers lately have been saying, look, is it because of the shutdown of the plant? Not necessarily. It's more got to do with the huge uplift we've had and the big seasonal change that we all witnessed in good rains, especially in South Australia and other parts. So look, that really brings us to where do we get it from? Typically, it's from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, which Andrew will go into, I'm sure, in his presentation as well. You can see the chart to the bottom left. We've got our typical import of urea per year. So obviously, we've had some big years now with very, very strong rains. So we've got a band generally between 2 and 2.4 million tonnes per year that's been required to be imported into Australia, plus Gibson Island in the last couple of years. So we're basically wholly reliant on an import supply chain at current, and lead times are often 8 to 10 weeks or in excess of that. So obviously, with the uplift in demand that we've seen, it's a long time to react, and obviously it arrives very late at the end of the season. So how do we get here? I'm sure this isn't any news to those listening and growers watching this. So look, obviously, the importers and growers are both expecting a drier year, something more like that on the left, potentially not that bad, but that's 2019 tried conditions there. but instead we've got obviously the picture on the right, which is the actual rainfall. So we're talking average to above average in some parts. You'll observe there that Western Australia didn't catch the rains as much as other parts did in the east, but particularly South Australia definitely experienced more favourable rains that has really run down that pipeline with demand increasing quite a bit. We've had reports of ordering up 50, 60, 70% on what was the demand forecast for the importers. So that's a huge strain on the supply chain. So obviously, coming to a season like this, importers and growers have been reluctant to lock in extra supplies. Obviously, the turning of the season was quite unexpected. We're all staring down the barrel of El Nino or a dry season. As stated before, 50 to 70% increases in demand on what the importers probably thought they were going to be having to dish out for this season. And you can see there from the map that once again that SA definitely received very, very favourable rains. Obviously, having more marginal country as well, people had more capacity to put on more urea and put that to work in the crop. WA not quite as bad. That's partly due to probably a better start in terms of supply, but also not so much of a swing in the season there. And East Coast as well had reports of people running out of urea as well, and not being able to get the urea on time or having to pick it up very late in the pickup windows. From our perspective, GrainGrowers is actually launching a Fertilizers of the Future report later this month, and I guess here in Australia, looking at the policy dilemma, if you want to call it that, is generally for production here, we've got low barriers to entry, meaning that it's fairly easy, very easy to import product into Australia. So you've always got competition there. And we do play in a very high cost space. I'm sure Andrew will speak to this as well. But in terms of the price of gas, it was noted by Incitec Pivot that they shut down Gibson Island because they couldn't get gas at a competitive price. And we make urea globally elsewhere at a lot lower cost. So if we were to make urea right now, Gibson Island arguably would be a lot more expensive than the urea people purchase this season at that price of, say, $500, $600, $700 a tonne. So in order to look at the end-to-end manufacturing scenario in Australia, we're actually releasing a series of reports, with the first one being on fertilizer. Now that covers the current technology of how it's made from natural gas, which I'm sure Andrew will touch on as well, but looking right through to modular units that Jupiter Onyx is currently got at a lab phase where you're making urea on farm. So it's a totally decentralized model and is a big paradigm shift in terms of making urea on farm from potentially green sources. So we look forward to publishing that, and we also welcome anyone to also have a look at the report showing what could be coming in the future. So that's about all I've got from my side, Brad. So over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate that valuable information, and looking forward to the report coming out. We'll keep an eye on that. And really good to get background on how we've come to the situation we're in and what to look for in the future. Just before I hand over to Andrew, our next speaker, make sure you get those questions in the Q&A box as you think of them, so we can put to the panel of experts later on. Now I'd like to introduce Andrew Whitelaw from episode 3, who's going to give us an update on global markets, urea imports, and some of the pricing challenges. Thanks, Andrew.
Right. Thanks, Brad. Again, I'll repeat what Sean was saying. Thanks for inviting us along to this. Thanks, GPSA. It's good for organizations like yourself to be putting out good information and good speakers. Well, the other two are good speakers, and about what's happening in the industry, because we need to make sure that all our farmers and all the stakeholders from the industry are well informed. So what do we do? Just as a quick introduction, episode 3 is an independent market analysis business. We provide free information to the industry through our website, episode3.net. But we also do a lot of consultancy work in the space of policy, data provision, all that sort of stuff. We also run a podcast, which is a bit of a hobby for my business partner and I. And yeah, so what we do is we just look at numbers. Really, it's all about. We find it interesting, but we try and make sure that the numbers are interesting for other people. So Brad asked me to come along to this webinar, and I thought it was worthwhile just to run through a bit of the basics of fertilizer and generally agricultural markets, and that is energy. When we look at agricultural markets, I just got a few charts here that just show, how the correlations that we have between energies and our commodities. So this chart here is one I always love to look at, is crude oil versus wheat. Basically, we've got a very strong correlation between crude oil and wheat, and that's for a number of reasons, including the fact that a lot of corn is used for biofuels, which is obviously an alternative to diesel and petrol, from which is derived from crude oil. But then we also look at other products. We've got things like glyphosate and gas. We can see a reasonably strong correlation between glyphosate and gas pricing. The reason behind that is the fact that it's highly energy intensive. We see the same with glyphosate and coal. In fact, it's actually got a stronger correlation, glyphosate and coal, which is, again, most glyphosate is made in China, heavily energy intensive, and a lot of their energy is derived from coal. So Sean had mentioned about natural gas, and that is one of the key ingredients. More than 75% of the input cost into making urea is natural gas. So we tend to see a very strong correlation between gas prices and urea. And even just at the moment, just to give you an example, in Australia is the 7th largest producer of natural gas in the world. We've got some union strikes in the gas industry, which has actually caused European gas prices to increase between 10 and 20% in the last couple of days, because it's concerns that a large part of the world's supply of gas will not be available. So what we tend to look at when we're looking at fertilizer, and especially urea, is that gas prices are basically a precursor to urea pricing. So we tend to find that if gas price is going to rise, then it's going to have a corresponding impact upon the urea price. And I'm sure Stephen may comment on this in a little bit, that there is been a whole host of issues in the last couple of years. We started off with COVID, then we had Putin, and we've had our own supply issues locally. But a big chunk of the price rise is attributed to gas. So again, this is just to show you that the correlation between urea pricing and gas pricing is pretty close, what we consider to be statistically significant. And so that's just another one just to show you the example of that. So, one of the things that we'll talk about supply in a little bit, but I think it's always important to talk about price as well, because, well, that's the most important thing really, is, well, once you've got access to it, you want to know what the price is. And it's not actually as bad as in the last couple of years as we'd like to think. If we actually look back and we take into account inflation, fertilizer prices, urea was actually a lot more expensive in the 1970s for very similar results to the reason why fertilizer prices are high in the last couple of years. And that was because there was an energy crisis, the Middle Eastern blockades, and that caused fertilizer prices to go through the roof during the 1970s energy crisis. So maybe some of us are old enough to remember that, but it's not as bad as it has been when we take into account inflation. So that's a bit of good news. What we tend to look at when we're looking at fertilizer pricing in Australia is most, not all, but most of our fertilizer will come from the Middle East. And so effectively that's an indicator of the price that we will pay in Australia. So we have seen, again, those huge increases in the last couple of years. They've actually started to come back down. They've had a bit of a spike in the last month or so, but still sitting at a much more appetizing level than it had previously. And to add a bit of transparency into the market and a bit of oversight into pricing, what we tend to do as a business is we add in that price in the Middle East. We add in a few other factors that gets that price to Australia, just to give us what is an effective landed price in Australia. It's not 100% accurate. We don't say it is. What it's there is to provide a bit of a trend of where prices should be. Again, prices are back to where they are normally, but probably the more important thing than just what the price is, it's what the barter value is. And this is what we call a barter chart. This is showing effectively in the gray line here, how many tons of wheat you've got to sell to buy a ton of urea. In the pink line, how many tons of canola. So that's actually more important. It's not how much you're paying for fertilizer. It's how much your margin has been impacted by that fertilizer. So what we can see is, because we've got relatively high prices for wheat, relatively high prices for fertilizer, canola, and much declined price in urea, we're actually seeing that the barter rate is actually pretty attractive. We're back to pretty much the normal levels, the normal range what we'd expect. And so that means we've had a bit of a cost price squeeze in recent years, and we have been lucky because we've had some pretty significant rainfall years. But now we're coming back to a level where actually fertilizer pretty cheap, and it's pretty profitable compared to the price of wheat and the price of canola, provided we get the rain. I just threw this one here in. Fertilizer has been quite valuable because it's allowed us in the last a couple of decades to actually consistently be able to produce a lot from each hectare of ground. So whilst the price of a Hilux has increased, the reality is that we're producing more from our land, in large part to technology, but also because of availability of fertilizers. That's just a bit of one to break things up. I'm going to go on to a bit of the numbers around supply, and there will be some nota benes at the end of this, just to explain some of these numbers. But this is a seasonality chart, and this shows basically the last 10 years, between 10 and 12 years of fertilizer imports of urea into Australia. So this sort of green banding in the middle is the standard deviation. So that's where you would expect it to be based on historical levels. And then you've got the dotted line is the average over that period. And then I've put in here the last couple of years of imports. So the data isn't up to date as of August. It's up to date as the most recent estimates, which are for June imports. June is always our, typically always our highest month for imports. This year we had pretty strong imports into May. I will talk a bit more about some of those numbers and why it's important to be very careful in using these numbers. But up until the end of June, we'd actually had record levels of imports into Australia. That can be quite confusing because we do have these issues at the moment around availability and access to supply of urea. So there are a few bits we have to including there. One of those is, as Sean alluded to, is we no longer have that Gibson Island plant. So technically, if we do a rudimentary figure here is adding in how much that Gibson Island plant would have roughly provided up until the end of June, we're actually, and this would see a sort of a good indicator of what our available supplies would be. And we'd be actually back to like second place instead of first place in terms of available supplies. It's much more important to take into account that domestic production, which is no longer available. The other thing that just to take into account with this is one, we've got some pretty strong years of production in Australia. We've had some really good rainfall, pretty much for the whole of the country. Basically 2020, 21, 22 have all been pretty strong years, or record years in fact. I'm not an agronomist, but effectively that sucks out a lot of nitrogen. I'm not telling you guys anything you guys don't know, but it sucks out a lot of nitrogen. So then we've got to actually put that nitrogen back into ground before we even start to think about what we need to do to increase productivity. So our demand should be significantly higher. Sean also mentioned the fact that there was these issues around the the weather forecasts being, I don't know if they were necessarily inaccurate. It's just that's this time of year, there are always going to be a certain level of inaccuracy to them. So looking at it, we've got a situation where technically our imports of urea are at record. Again, I mentioned the fact that we've lost the domestic processing, so we do need to import more. We also need more because of the fact that we've sucked out so much nitrogen through growing some pretty strong crops. We've also got the fact of the matter is, just because we've got record imports doesn't mean it's all in the right places at the right time. So that's why we're saying that it's kind of regionalized some of those stock availability issues. So again, what we think would be good is if there's more information out there on what has been imported or what is due to be imported, so that people can make more stronger decisions. So I just left a few questions here of what the industry sort of, don't have the answers to it, but what the industry might need to consider over the next couple of years is, one, we've got the potential sale of IPA. There's rumors that it's the IPL is getting sold to an Indonesian state-owned company. That in itself is not necessarily a major issue, but we also have the Perdaman facility, which is due to open in 2026, 2027, I believe, which will produce 90% of our local demand. IPL does have the offtake agreement for 20 years for all the urea from that facility. So I guess there's two questions to the future of that is it in the national interest for that IPL sale with the offtake agreement to be sold to an Indonesian state-owned company? I think in recent years there's been, and this is, I don't say I think, I know there's an issue because we hear it all the time, is there's a lack of trust between stakeholders within the industry, between farmers and the fertilizer representatives. Like we've all been told in the last 5 years, every year, that there's going to be a shortage of urea. Get your order in quick before it runs out, and it's never happened until now. And so it's created almost a bit like that old kid story, it's the boy who cried wolf. And we'd sort of warned people from the fertilizer, they can't keep telling people there's going to be a shortage every year, because they won't believe it. The farmers won't believe it when a shortage does come. So I think something needs to be done to increase that trust and transparency between the factors. We want to make sure that farmers are actually, when they do know what they want, they put the order in, and they make sure that they're able to get access to what they're requiring. We need to look at stability of supply. The fact that we are going to be producing a lot of fertilizer in northern Western Australia is one thing that does provide some sort of welcome addition to Australia's fertilizer imports or domestic demand mix. However, that's still going to be priced on international values, but it is still a good thing. And we also need to be very careful and start thinking about what the green policies are with fertilizer usage, and that is the wider picture of it is our emissions, because at some point our customers are going to be questioning a lot of these emissions. And I believe there's some information out there about nitrogen inhibitors and all sorts of other stuff. So we need to be very at the forefront of policy to ensure that we have access to the tools that we need to produce what we're good at. So yeah, that's basically the very short, sharp summary of trying to keep it to that sort of 15 minutes. And I hope that's been provided some insights. It's not going to cover everything. And I'll pass you back to Brad. I think we've got some questions at the end.
Thanks, Andrew. Always great to hear your insights. Yeah, plenty of information to process there as well. Before I hand over to our final presenter, just a quick reminder again that if you want your questions to be asked at the end, please put them in the Q&A box as you think of them, and we'll get those to our panelists later on. Our final presenter this afternoon is Stephen Annells from Fertilizer Australia. He's going to get us thinking as he discusses where to from here with nitrogen fertilizer. Thanks, and over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Brad, and thank you to Grain Producers South Australia for hosting this webinar. Thank you. Just a quick outline of what Fertilizer Australia is. We're the peak body for the Australian fertilizer industry. Our members make up somewhere between about 96 and 97% of the tonnes that are imported, manufactured, and distributed through Australia. Our role isn't to sell more fertilizer or to inspire people to buy more fertilizer. Our role is to drive the sustainable and responsible use of fertilizer and to maintain the social license for growers to use fertilizer. We don't often talk about supply. We try and stay away from it. As an industry body, anything that we say that changes prices isn't great. So, but we will talk a little bit about the current situation, and also give you some insight into what's happening in the nitrogen fertilizer space. So Australia uses about 1.3 to 1.9 million tonnes of elemental nitrogen every year, and that's the 46% of urea. That's nitrogen, and that's made up of the numbers there in the slide, and you can see we're very highly reliant on urea. So we were expecting there'd be a severe drop in end usage in 2022-23, considering back to June last year. And sorry, this slide's is going ahead too fast. The effects of the Chinese restrictions on nitrogen, residual effects of COVID on supply chain, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which largely impacted on ammonium nitrate, and then coming back to the more recent issues, as Sean touched on, the expectations of an El Nino event, and high prices dampening or deferring demand, growers waiting for prices to drop, led to a diminishing number of contracts. And in a market where prices are dropping, no one wants to take a long position. And as such, our members bought in as much as was needed for those contracts. So despite that, Australia's total fertilizer consumption was 7.25 million tonnes. That's a record. And as Anu touched on, a lot of that came from the fact that growers were replacing the nutrients in their soils from two excellent years with great rainfall and great yields. The previous record, which was actually in the last financial period, was 7.05 million tonnes, and those stats have just come off the press last week. So urea was up by 12%, sulphate of ammonia was up by 1%. UAN was down 22%. That's largely due to the ammonium nitrate component of UAN, which comes from Russia. The sanctions put a bit of a dampener on the ability to get the volumes of ammonium nitrate that are needed for UAN. But for South Australian farmers, this is largely a Western Australian issue. Liquid nitrogen is very much a Western Australian staple, and so a lot of that was taken up by urea in Western Australia. DAP was down 8% and MAP was up 14%. So after giving you that background, I'll have a bit of a chat about where to from here. Can I just reassure everyone, there's actually plenty of fertilizer out there. The global supply of fertilizer hasn't dropped away. There are people out there talking down the supplies of phosphorus, but that's not the case. The world has plenty of phosphorus, and there's certainly plenty of nitrogen fertilizer out there. There isn't a global supply issue. And to add to that, when markets are tight, when there is a tight supply market, the product goes to the countries that can pay for it first. So countries like the US, Canada, countries in Western Europe, and Australia who can afford to pay for those fertilizers will get those fertilizers. The reverse of the other side of that coin is there are countries that do miss out. There's countries like India, there's countries, sub-Saharan African countries that do miss out, and I'll step into that in a little bit later on. But despite the supply issues that were experienced during COVID, China and Russia, we still had two of the biggest fertilizer importing seasons in history, and that's a testament to the Australian fertilizer suppliers. They're actually able to get the product into Australia. Australia uses only 1% of the world's fertilizer. We're not a big player, and like grain, for the same reason, we're a price taker. And if we look at the derivatives that Andrew pointed out, we basically take the prices that the rest of the world provides us. We put a little bit of a profit margin on top, and that's basically the prices that we see in Australia. So global urea production is around about 260 million tonnes. This is expected to increase to about 230 million tonnes by 300 million tonnes by 2030. And as I discussed earlier, those poorer nations, India, Africa, and Iran, are in the process of building fertilizer plants for their own domestic supply, but also as supply is static and demand is cyclical, they probably will export some of that product as well. Australian fertilizer suppliers source fertilizer from all over the world. As we went through some of the supply issues in COVID, our AgChem colleagues were really struggling. A lot of their product comes from China, but Australia's suppliers have diversified. We've got lots and lots of markets all over the world. We can move from one market to another to make sure that we can access supply, and that's a testament to the supply strength of the Australian market. We've also got some domestic production potentially in Australia. And I say potential, that there are a lot of issues that actually these companies may face. New Riser in South Australia taking advantage of the gas in the coal seam at Lee Creek. Strike Energy in Western Australia at Geraldton, and as Andrew mentioned, Perdaman up in the northwest of Western Australia. And if these come off, there's an expected 2 to 6 million tonnes that will be produced. My apologies for this slide. I'm not quite sure what's jumping forward a slide. If successful, Australia could be a net exporter. And as Andrew pointed out, there are some concerns around what will be happening with Perdaman. But if successful is a big issue. Manufacturing in Australia is expensive. Our IR restrictions, industrial relation restrictions, and our environmental restrictions, plus the price of gas in Australia does make it expensive. And when prices drop away, it does make it very, very difficult to compete with imports. And as Sean noted, there's no restriction to people importing fertilizer, only some biosecurity requirements. So that creates a very, very, very low barriers to entry for imported products. So it makes it very hard for these local manufacturers to compete. However, we actually do wish them the best, and we actually we work with them, and we work with the government to try and find ways that what they're trying to do is successful. So I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the issues we're facing. Andrew alluded to some of the emissions stuff. I'm going to spend a bit of time on emissions, and I'm also going to then talk about some of the how that relates to domestic production. So some of the domestic restrictions we face with nitrogen is the risk of leachates into the Great Barrier Reef catchment zone. Obviously, it's not all that relevant to South Australia, but it's a very big part of what Fertilizer Australia does, working with the Queensland government. But an issue that is becoming more and more prominent and growing by the day is the issue of greenhouse gas emissions from nitrogen fertilizers, in particular from urea. That's nitrous oxide and ammonia. So nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. It's 297 times more potent than carbon dioxide, which means that if there's a ton of nitrous oxide, it's equivalent to 297 tons of CO2. I don't know how they do those calculations. I'll leave that to the scientists, but apparently that's the case. And ammonia is an indirect greenhouse gas. And please don't ask me what an indirect greenhouse gas means. My technical guy says, so I'm just repeating what they say. And we look at what's happened around the world. Canada went through a process of attempting to reduce its emissions from fertilizer by 30% in a very unnuanced way, which was basically to cut nitrogen fertilizer by 30%. New Zealand has restrictions on nitrogen applications. There's a requirement to record and report on nitrogen applications, as well as on restrictions on emissions from livestock. And the EU has various restrictions on nitrogen applications, the strongest of which is in the Netherlands, where they have very intensive agriculture and risks of leachates getting into their waterways. Sri Lanka, in 2021, it moved from inorganic sources of fertilizer to organic sources of fertilizer. Their agricultural industry collapsed, and then subsequently, due to that and various other structural reasons, their economy collapsed. We've got regenerative farming, which is encouraging a move away from intensive farming, fertilizer use. This voice from regenerative farming is very, very strong. There is a very, very strong lobby to the government on that, and the government likes listening to these sorts of things. Excuse me. But with the world's population model to reach just under 10 billion people by 2050, we need these fertilizers to feed and clothe the world. So domestically, the issues that we're facing. The Labor government, when they came in May last year, immediately introduced tougher emissions targets. We knew they were coming, and so we've been on the front foot with the government on these to give them the ability to be able to meet their targets without damaging the agricultural sector. We did have fears that the government may just copy what's happened in Canada and in New Zealand. We have grave concerns about how Canada managed their process. They basically went ahead and made these cuts without too much discussion with industry, without too much discussion with grower groups, and they had to walk back those targets. So basically now those targets are redundant because they're voluntary. They don't really mean too much, but I'm not quite sure that our current government will actually walk those back if they were to go down that path. There's very heavy, as I mentioned earlier, there's very heavy lobbying in Australia by the regenerative farming groups, and there's ongoing doom and gloom with regard to the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is in excellent condition. We haven't had any cyclones for the last few years, but they're still talking down the quality and still pointing the finger at nitrogen fertilizers. So Fertilizer Australia, we actively lobby the federal government, as well as the Western Australian government. They have concerns about soluble phosphates getting into their coastal waterways, and obviously the Queensland government with the Great Barrier Reef. A couple of the things that we're doing with regard to the emissions, and if any of you saw the Weekly Times yesterday, there was an article in there about pre-farm aggregation of carbon credits, and that's a complicated way of saying that we would like to put carbon credits towards the price of treated ureas, and those treated ureas will assist in leachates and also in preventing volatilization to those greenhouse gases, and the carbon credits will assist to bring the price of the treatment down to be able to make them more affordable. We're also working on an emissions white paper. We want to demonstrate to the federal government what Australian farmers are already doing. We have very, very efficient farmers in Australia. They use their nutrients very, very well. The nutrient use efficiency is very high, and so we want to temper the expectations of the government. If they're going to go and make changes to things, they need to understand what those changes will do. And if they go and attempt to do something like they did in Canada, they're not going to see the results they're expecting they're going to see. What they're going to see is a collapse of the agricultural industry, massive damage to regional areas, and massive damage to our exports. the white paper goes through and ranks Australia in amongst the world's nutrient use efficiency countries, the best countries that use nutrients efficiently, but also breaks up Australia into the sectors. So in South Australia, in the cropping area, a lot of dryland cropping, virtually sometimes cropping on the edge of a desert. The amount of emissions that's actually released from those fertilizers that you use is very small. So we want to make sure that the government is aware of where they make the changes and how they make the changes. And it appears from the Bush Summit that was held in Tamworth last Friday that the Prime Minister has heard the message, and he's talking there about efficient fertilizer use, nutrient use efficiency effectively, and also talking about the use of different sorts of fertilizers. So this is a more nuanced way of dealing with this than the Canadians did. Basically, rather than restricting or reducing the amount of fertilizer that is used, we're talking about more efficient use of fertilizer and use of fertilizers that will release less emissions. Just want to quickly step into back into the domestic production and put the two together with the emissions and give you some idea of some of the work that we're doing. Many fertilizers come from mined products, potassium and phosphorus mainly. There's a big pocket of phosphorus in the Georgina Basin on the Queensland and Northern Territory border, and there's numerous potassium projects in Western Australia that are underway. But inorganic nitrogen fertilizer is derived from a chemical process, and this process requires gas, electricity, and some of the infrastructure that you can see in this picture. And this infrastructure is billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. So it requires quite a bit of investment from companies that are in the process of actually setting this up. And as Andrew alluded to, the price of gas as well is a very significant issue. The price of gas in Australia is high. The price of electricity in Australia is high. So that creates issues. However, there is another side to it. Not only is the government concerned about the emissions that come post-application from putting urea on the ground, they're also now starting to be concerned about the intrinsic emissions that are already in that fertilizer from upstream supply chains. So the production of the fertilizer produces greenhouse gas emissions. The transportation of the fertilizer creates greenhouse gas emissions, and the application of it creates greenhouse gas emissions. So we're working with the Department of Industry through the Office of Supply Chain Resilience. We're constantly lobbying them and talking to them about the government getting more involved in assisting domestic production to become a reality. If you consider using Australia's clean energy sources to reduce emissions in production, that's reducing a bit more of that footprint. Transportation, reduced emissions from shipping, sulfur and diesel fumes. Application will probably be neutral, that probably wouldn't change that much. But then treated fertilizers, reducing emissions once it's been applied. Along that pathway, there's a fairly significant reduction in emissions, but that requires the government to get involved in making sure that these domestic projects actually get up. So that's the end of my talk. Again, I want to thank Grain Producers South Australia for putting this forum on. I think it's been good and a valuable resource for South Australian farmers. But I just want to also reassure that the issues we're facing at the moment are short-lived issues. That I think as Sean said, that it was a perfect storm when it comes to urea supply, and in that perfect storm it rained as well, so it created some significant issues with supply for some growers, not all growers, but it is a short-lived issue.
Many thanks, Stephen. Great way to end our presentations this afternoon, and plenty to think about from what you've discussed today. So now for question time. So a big thank you to those who have submitted questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A box. If you think of any more questions as we go, or you want to ask some follow-on questions to answers, again, please pop them in that Q&A box and we'll endeavour to answer them. So the first question is, and we might throw this one to Sean to start with. and feel free other panelists to chip in as well. What's the solution for grain growers going into next year? Is the advice always to order ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Had the same question on the country hour earlier this morning. Look, it really is down to your individual risk profile. I mean, obviously, we did have that perfect storm this year where both importers and growers probably wanted to, commit to it as little as possible. Like urea is basically a cash and carry trade, mainly for importers as well. So, look, if you're, I think once bitten, twice shy, you can often overreact and hoard more. But look, if you've been caught out this year, on the back of a changing weather forecast, I mean, you'd have to ask yourself, do you want a bit more on the shed coming into it? I think when you look at the pricing trends, and this is not financial advice, but natural gas does seem to be, bouncing around the bottom there, and that's the main driver of prices. Andrew spoke to. So, I think, if you feel it's a price at which you can make money and you can hedge some of that risk, then it might be sensible. But that's, obviously at an individual farmer level there. You've got to make what the decisions that make sense for you in the end.
Can I jump in, Brad, as well on this question?
Yeah, Andrew.
What I would say as well is, Sean's completely right there. It's down to the individual, but it's also down to, like, supply is one thing. Supply is going to be the one that you're going to be concerned about, but there's no strategy that works every single year. Same as when you're selling grain. It's not a case of, you can sell every July or every December and make a shed ton of money. It just doesn't work that way. Commodity markets aren't like that. What you have to look at as well, yes, you may want to buy more for next year if the price was right. If you can lock in a price that is attractive and works with your margins, then maybe lock away a percentage of what you would require. But bearing in mind, you don't want to be stuck with a lot of fertilizer you can't use because El Nino rears its head and you have a drought. So you just got to look at it strategically every year. I think a good line of communications with your supplier or suppliers. Again, I think it's also good to have a diversification of suppliers to make sure that if anything goes wrong, that you don't end up high and dry. So I think it's not a case of every year the same thing. And this, again, is a whole series of situations that have transpired all at the same time. So I would just be taking it as a year by year approach, dependent on price, outlooks in the weather, and what you normally require.
And just to follow up on that, thanks, Andrew and Sean, for that answer. I know that some suppliers were rationing as well this season. Do you envisage that after such a shortage that we might actually see growers purchasing and doing a little bit of stockpiling?
Look, I think I'll just jump in there. I think, we will see a bit more people getting, twice bitten, once shy, and people will be hoarding a bit more, potentially keeping a bit more for those seasons where they're concerned that stocks are going to become an issue. I think if we look back historically, this is not something that's going to happen every year. I think it's like a 1 in 10, 1 in 20, not 1 in 2. We've seen it in the past with things like glyphosate. Is that people when glyphosate is dropped in price, people have stored lots more shuttles of glyphosate or other chemicals. But I think that's probably an easier thing to store than fertilizer. So I'd be very hesitant for farmers to be storing big licks of expensive fertilizer unless they've got the storage capabilities to make sure that they don't end up with a big brick of fertilizer 12 months time that they can't put through their chutes. So I think people will be considering that. But is it a case, and maybe it requires some thinking from the fertilizer industry, is it a case of buying and storing, or is it a case of buying it on a contract for delivery at a later date? That's what I'd be more thinking that farmers should do, is buy it on a contract for collection next June, as opposed to buying it just now and sticking it in a shed and then worrying about what condition it's going to be when it comes out.
Thanks, Andrew. This question is from Tom. Again, I might throw this open to all the panelists. and I know Andrew did point out that he was keen to answer this one, but after low
I think
and
I
now
clicked
no
that by accident.
domestic.
I think I clicked that by accident, Brad, actually.
You're a glutton for punishment. After low and no domestic production of urea for many years, what's prompted 3 companies to simultaneously develop plans for large-scale local production in Australia?
I can jump in there. Look, there's often projects on the boil. These projects, as I said, they're fairly well advanced. But these projects mainly started well before there were supply issues, well before COVID. These things take a long time. I think there was probably just an opportunistic look at the market. But also there are often proposals in Australia, whether they come off or whether they don't come off, is sort of up to the economics.
Just to add something in on that one as well. This is a complete gratuitous plug. On the Ag Watchers podcast, we did a podcast, episode 57 of that podcast with the CEO of the Lee Creek, which is now Urea, and so that has some insights into why they're looking at their fertilizer plant in South Australia. So
Thanks, Stephen and Andrew. And just a follow-on question to you, Stephen, as well. Just to give listeners a bit of an understanding of local manufacturing of urea. How easy is it to do? How long does it take? And sort of what is the actual impact on the market if you can get these online?
Look, easiness isn't there. It is a very, very expensive process to set up a plant. Though the modules that Sean put forward would be quite revolutionary in that space. But they take a lot of years. It's a massive industrial process to produce urea. So it does take years to actually construct those billions of dollars. But I suppose the benefit, and maybe where that question's leading to, is you take away, the months of lead time to potentially, weeks of lead time. So it does create a much more ready source of nutrient.
Thanks, Stephen. All right, we'll move on to the next question from Adrian. And again, I'll throw this over in the panel. What about, and again, this is a bit of a statement actually, but what about the role and responsibilities of the import suppliers to get supply and to carry a bit?
I think it's an interesting statement and question, but I think what is the responsibility of an importer? Well, let's be honest, the responsibility of an importer is to make profits for their shareholders. And yeah, I'm sure they could handle stock, but is the grower willing to pay a premium to ensure that those importers carry stock for X number of years? And I think it was Stephen, it might have been Sean, they had mentioned about the fact that we were coming into a market at the start of this year where the fertilizer market collapsed effectively from its peaks. Do you want to be carrying that stock for 12 months at $1,400 a ton when all your competitors are bringing in at $600 a ton? So yeah, it would be nice in theory for fertilizer companies and importers to be bringing in stock and then holding it there to make sure it's available for you, but it's just not realistic. It's not what's going to happen. And these are commercial entities, and yes, they can hold stock for you, but they're going to charge you for it. They're going to charge the cost of carry for that stock to be sitting there.
Oh, I think Andrew's correct. I think there is a little bit more empathy for the grower community, perhaps, than that. Yes, they are there to make profits, but we also want to make sure that growers are getting their product. This has been a hard time for the fertilizer industry as well. But if we look at what happened in 2008, 2009, when there was that peak, on the other side of that, we lost quite a few fertilizer companies because they were carrying stock, and they were caught out with massive losses with products. So you are as good as your last import. And these guys are taking risks at 50,000 tonnes at a time versus a grower taking a risk at 50 to 100 tonnes at a time. So it is a level of risk that the industry takes. And there are many people that are in the industry that were there back in 2008, 2009, or have heard the stories. And so I think we talked about once bitten, twice shy earlier. There were companies that were very, very concerned about taking a long position in a falling market. When you get a more stable market, then yeah, potentially there's an opportunity to have a bit more of a stockpile or have a bit of a risk. But it is very, very difficult to do that in a falling market when a market is falling so rapidly.
Yeah, Brad, I might just jump in as well, just to round out. But the cost of building a urea plant, I think it's $1.5 billion, and we're looking at several years. But like Andrew said and Stephen, but it's very hard to hedge. It's not like a grain cargo where you can be hedged right up until when it lands or when you're selling it. So it is like trading, say, pulses. It's very much a cash market. Just with some light on the horizon, and this is a gratuitous plug now for our report, but that Jupiter Ionics technology and there's some others, having modular unit on farm where theoretically it makes 300 kilos of fertilizer for you each day. You can, stockpile that on farm. That potentially is the answer many years from now. That's obviously still in a lab stage, but I guess that might be of interest to growers as well that want to have a look at that technology and where that could end up.
Thank you all. We've got a question from Stefan. It was a statement, but we'll turn it into a question, and we'll put this one to Sean, I think. So the biggest issue in urea and fertilizer markets is that suppliers don't follow contracted terms. Suppliers have been 5 weeks late, and farmers this year have had to rebook alternate suppliers. So I guess that's a question around contract challenges, Sean, and what feedback have you been hearing on this issue?
Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Look, I'm not a lawyer. I just want to say that off the bat. But in terms of fertilizer contracts, it's often sold on a window. It's basically a seller's option window. So the grower, might have ordered their urea for June, July pickup, and they've probably got used to, it being in the shed and there's not a lot of pressure. There is extra buffer in the supply chain, and they've been able to come and get their loads ahead of time in that window. I guess we've found out here, because we ran so tight and in some cases have, run out, that people found out that window is at the fertilizer seller's discretion, and they've used that obviously to hold people off to the last minute. So I've spoken to a lot of growers in our membership, and there's definitely been cases where people have been left to the last week to get a load, or they've had to say, look, what do you really need? I know what you want, but what do you need? Let's get down to week by week loads, applying them on farm. So look, now if there's anyone that's had any issues, obviously that's between the fertilizer supplier and the buyer of that fertilizer. But yeah, obviously I believe as well, Stephen, the Fertilizer Australia has some model contracts as well on their website, which might be worth looking at. Yeah, we do. We for the and again, this was an issue that came out of 2008, 2009. We have a template contract that supply companies can use, and that's on our website, so growers can see that as well. We're also doing some work with the ACCC at the moment on that contract, so a new one might come out soon.
Thanks, guys. Quick question. We might head to Andrew for this one. So talk about record level of inputs of your imports, I should say, of urea into Australia. Where's it gone?
Look, that's a good question, and I might move this one on to Stephen. Actually, I might handball this one. Look, we only have the data for what is nationally imported. We don't. We sort of occasionally look at it at a sort of a more granular level. At the moment, look, it seems anecdotally that a lot of it is has gone into the West, and they seem to be having a lot less issues around supply. And I think South Australia has imported, well, when I say imported, they've trucked fertilizer across the Nullarbor, I'm hearing, which is a a significant distance to go. But in terms of where it's going, that's, I guess, the interesting question, is because we do have technically on paper record imports and second record supplies. Where it's going is the question, and I think that's, you know, just a function of the fact that it potentially is just all available, just in the wrong places at the wrong time. And so I think that's just that's going to be a frustration when we see that data, that there's big imports, but you still can't get access to it necessarily where you want it this year. But I think you know, Stephen might have some answers on that in terms of, you know, where the biggest shortages are around the country.
We don't collect data on where the stuff's coming into a port or into a catchment zone. We collect data on where the sales are. But anecdotally, what I've heard is concerns all up and down the eastern seaboard, and I think it isn't necessarily in the wrong place. I just think that there was issues of growers not contracting. I've heard it in Queensland, in northern New South Wales, in southern New South Wales, in Victoria, or in South Australia. To a lesser degree in Western Australia. There is a different model in Western Australia for how the fertilizer gets to the growers. But from what I can gather anecdotally, it's been reasonably widespread.
Thank you both for your answers there. This one's a bit of a tricky one. I don't know who can actually answer this, and if you can, but we've got a question here. What was the most expensive urea sale this year? And the point was that it actually had to be delivered to farmers. Some urea came from over 3,300 kilometers away by road freight to feed crops. Does anyone want to have a go at that one?
Well, I reckon Stefan himself could probably answer a bit of this himself. So if we look at it from a point of view of fertilizer, let's use a rough number this season for urea. $650 a ton on average at port for the last sort of 4 or 5 months, and then we just add on the freight for 3,300 kilometers, which, you know, Stefan's probably got a better handle of that than me because he's a grain broker. So I can't really answer that off the top of my head without a calculator, but yeah, significantly expensive if you're trucking it across the Nullarbor.
Brad, if I can just add to that as well, like I think, you know, I've heard from growers that you know, obviously those that are really organised, got their orders in early, paid the higher prices in a falling market. But I guess it swings and roundabouts. Like next year, you might get rewarded for being organised in a rising market too. So yeah, just want to acknowledge that, and I know that would have been something that the viewers might have been thinking about as Andrew was answering as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think Stefan's point was that it was very expensive at particular points throughout the season to get access to, and then to freight on top of that. Just a question, Stephen. You mentioned about you know, and Sean did as well. This is a perfect storm this year, and you know, we don't think that this will happen again. What's the outlook for next season at the moment? And I might throw to all of you on this.
I'll just get the crystal ball out, Brad. So I think look, when you look at the global indicators, like a lot of the overseas, you know, bureaus have already sort of called an El Nino. So we know we've had some very solid years, you know, so I mean, you know, we'd probably be tipping dry conditions, which obviously, you know, always eventuate. I can see here locally the BOM's got it at El Nino alert. At least they did when I checked a couple of days ago. So if that comes to fruition, you know, ironically, we could have more urea in country than we need next year, depending on the position of the importers. So yeah, that it's going to come down to, you know, that forecast as per usual, and we know that, you know, droughts always come. So we hope there isn't, but yeah, it's, you know, it's definitely on the cards and something that could play out as importers probably did expect this year.
Yeah, what's in track for next year. I think we talk about how it's not expected. It's is a series of events that have all transpired to create this perfect storm. And I guess what I would say is that just because there's a 1 in 1,000 year storm doesn't mean next year can't be a 1 in 1,000 year storm, or 1 in 100 year storm. Anything can happen, and anything does happen in markets and in the world. But if you look at the last couple of years, we had sort of really 3 really strong years, and you could have argued that we shouldn't have really had 3 really strong years in a row. And we're probably going to come into probably an average year this year. And so statistically, we shouldn't have had that many good years in a row. If you were a betting man, you're just looking at odds, you would have said that probably last year we should have been a drought. But it wasn't. It was a fantastic year. Next year, again, you could point towards it and say next year should be a drought based on the fact that on average over the last 100 years, it's basically 2 to 2.5 years between what we consider to be a dry year and a wet year, and vice versa. So I guess every year you're getting closer to a drought. And so you'd put statistically next year should be dry. However, a bit like all economics and all statistics, 97.65% of statistics are made up on the spot. And we could see that next year's a drought, next year's a dry year. We just don't know. But I would be hedging my bets on it probably being drier just based on the numbers and based on El Nino, rearing its head.
Stephen, outlook?
Look, nothing ever good happens when an industry body tries to speculate on these things, but I do agree with Sean and Andrew. I think getting crystal ball out is very, very difficult. But at some stage we'd have to have a dry or more normal year. But we'll have to see what happens with the when the rain does come and when the season with what happens next year.
Excellent. Well, we've reached the end of our webinar. So can you please join me in thanking our presenters this afternoon, Sean Cole from GrainGrowers, Andrew Whitelaw from episode 3, and Stephen Annells from Fertilizer Australia. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. On behalf of GPSA, I'd like to thank all of you who joined this afternoon. I hope that it's been informative for you and you've managed to get the information that you're after. We're wishing you all the best for the season, future seasons. Thanks again for joining us.